everyone, I've always personally bought AMD graphics cards, and even before that I then bought ATI graphics cards, before AMD bought ATI. But 1 year ago I actually bought the RTX 5080 Founders Edition, which was an absolutely brilliant card, but since it's been just over 1 year since I switched from Team Red to Team Green, I wanted to do this video and talk about my experience. And firstly I should say that I don't really think in terms of Team Red and Team Green, even though I just said that. I think that you should always buy the graphics card that is best for your requirements and for your budget when you actually come to buy. In other words, this video isn't going to be like, AMD good, NVIDIA bad, or vice versa, because, they both bloated capitalist companies. We should actually just buy what is best for us. And that brings me on to my first point, which is that AMD often price things as like NVIDIA minus 50. You see this discussed a lot in Reddit, along with people saying that AMD never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, which is a point I'll probably come back to throughout this video. But basically, AMD's strategy has always been to be slightly cheaper than the equivalent NVIDIA card. And that, I guess, is why I've always traditionally gone with AMD or ATI graphics cards and not NVIDIA ones. Because in the past, I've been more of a casual gamer, apart from Rocket League, where I clocked up like over 1,000 hours in a very short space of time. But ignoring that particular addiction, in general, when I've gone to upgrade my GPU or build a new computer, I've always looked at the full market, looked at the reviews, and seen that AMD were a bit cheaper. And as a casual gamer who wasn't doing anything else on the side, such as content creation, which I'll talk about in a minute, but because I wasn't doing that then, it just made sense to go with AMD. And that's kind of been the pattern for decades. Even now, if you look at reviews of the RTX 5070 Ti and the AMD Radeon 9070 XT, they are very, very similar. In fact, sometimes the 9070 XT card can be ahead of the 5070 Ti, especially for native rendering. If you want a game at 4K and have 200 Hz, NVIDIA will probably work out better for reasons I'll explain later. But in all other situations, if you do native rendering or you don't care too much about the upscaling quality, the AMD graphics card will just work. And actually last year I did test out a 9070 XT and I wanted it to be my main card, and yeah, unfortunately it couldn't be, even though for gaming it was very, very good. I remember testing out Cyberpunk at 4K with no ray tracing and getting a stable 60 FPS, which is really, really good. That seemed like a massive step in the right direction, especially since the card was priced around £600 at launch, and even now it's only £650, whereas the 5070 Ti, so the equivalent card, has often sold out, and as a result the only remaining cards are £800. So at least right now in the UK, it would make sense to get the 9070 XT compared to the 5070 Ti. It's kind of a no-brainer based on that massive price difference. And going back to gaming, even with ray tracing on, I couldn't quite get ray tracing overdrive or something like that, but with RT low, it wasn't too bad. I was getting 40 to 50 FPS with native rendering, which isn't great, but this was a year ago, before FSR 4 and Redstone had come out and actually been implemented into Cyberpunk. And I think, yeah, for the money, getting a 9070 XT and getting that level of ray traced gaming performance is actually pretty good. And that's at 4K. If you only had a 1440p monitor, you could actually game at that with RT low on and get 80 to 90 FPS. And then, if you did add frame gen on times 2 as well, then you could actually get really good high refresh rate gaming. However, at the higher end of things, super high refresh rate gaming at 1440p with the maximum graphical settings, or 4K at higher refresh rates, because, 50 to 60 FPS isn't always the best, then NVIDIA kind of is in a league of its own. AMD and Intel don't really have cards that can compete at that level. And I'll talk more about gaming stuff in a minute, but next I wanted to talk about the software panels, because with an AMD graphics card, you're going to have the AMD software. With NVIDIA, you're going to have the NVIDIA app and also the NVIDIA control panel, which in itself is quite confusing. I know NVIDIA control panel is older and they slowly migrate into the NVIDIA app, but in general it's confusing to have both. And if you want VRR or certain things, FreeSync and G-Sync and things, you've got to go into the NVIDIA control panel and do things there. But then if you want to do DLSS overrides and stuff, you've got to go into the NVIDIA app, so it does get a bit confusing. Whereas with AMD, everything is just within that AMD software panel, and yeah, it's just easier and it just works and it's more in a centralized place. Having said that though, they both buggy. Sometimes I go to change a setting in the AMD software or in the NVIDIA app and they think about it for a bit and then seem to just forget the setting. And I think NVIDIA is probably slightly worse for this than with AMD, but both can be a little bit buggy. And since we're on that topic, I wanted to talk about FSR, which is obviously AMD's upscaling and machine learning technologies. And obviously FSR 3 generally had a reputation for being pretty terrible, but obviously FSR 4 was launched to much fanfare. There were lots of demos showing just how good it was, and that is great, but actually when the 9070 XT first launched, it was only supported by a few dozen games. I was really eager to test it out, and even some of the games that it said were supported didn't actually work for me. I just couldn't get FSR 4 support on them. And I know now things are a lot better. I think I counted earlier on and there were over 200 games that are listed as having FSR Redstone support, which is brilliant, and that is actually genuinely genuinely something that AMD should be commended for. But in general, NVIDIA are far ahead here. There's many more games that support DLSS 4, and also many more GPUs as well. Because remember, like, DLSS 4 goes back to the RTX 20 series, whereas FSR 4 is only supported on the RX 9000 series, which is a bit of a pity because if you've got, like, an RX 7000 series GPU, you're stuck at FSR 3, and in some games, it is really, really terrible. And not every game, like in some games, FSR 3 is perfectly passable. But yeah, in other games, especially like Cyberpunk and everything else, there's like such a massive gulf between like DLSS 4.5 and FSR 3. And I'm not saying any of this to bash AMD. I know I said this in the intro, but halfway through the video, I'm going to say it again, which is that, I like AMD. I've always previously bought AMD graphics cards, but just, a year ago when I bought an NVIDIA graphics card, I really started to see the difference and some of the benefits you get with an NVIDIA graphics card compared to AMD. And the next benefit is actually that things are a little bit buggier and more time-consuming with an AMD graphics card. And that's why I just had that disclaimer, because I'm not trying to bait anyone or annoy everyone. But like if you even go through the AMD Radeon subreddit, what you'll notice is people talk about how, with FSR 4, sometimes the implementation is really bad and buggy in a certain game, and they need to resort to OptiScaler to fix that. And it is good that OptiScaler exists, so if you've got, an RX 7000 series GPU, you can get FSR 4 and stuff, but just in general, especially with a 9000 series card, you shouldn't need to sometimes resort to, loads of hacks and OptiScaler and things like that to get a good playable experience in the latest games. And in 99% of cases, you don't need to do that with an NVIDIA GPU, with one important exception, which was driver stability, because when I bought my RTX 5080 Founders Edition just over a year ago, everything was crashing. I couldn't play Cyberpunk because it was crashing a lot, video editing was stuttering and everything else, even though actually nowadays, having an RTX 50 series card is brilliant for video editing, which I'll talk about in a minute. But just in general, at launch, just over a year ago, the NVIDIA drivers were completely terrible, and AMD's ones were really smooth. Thankfully though, those drivers have stabilized, and I've got RTX 5070 Ti in here, which I use for gaming and video editing, and right now things are a lot more stable, thankfully. And in addition to that, I get other apps too, which I just didn't have with AMD. For example, NVIDIA Broadcast, which is a bit of software you can download, and it's basically like a virtual webcam, so it like takes over your webcam, and then it can enhance the video of it, even sort of having virtual lighting, so you don't need to run out and buy really expensive lighting. You can just enable this option, and then suddenly the image quality and everything else is a lot better. Equally, you've got things like denoising for both the video and the audio. You can remove background noise and echo and things like that on the audio side. And in general, the AMD software doesn't have anywhere near as much options. I think it might have audio denoising in one particular case, but in general, NVIDIA Broadcast is such a massive step up. And I don't really hear people talking about this much, and maybe I'm going to sound like an NVIDIA fanboy, but just in general, with an AMD graphics card, you're not going to have that, but with an NVIDIA one, you are. But of course, then price is a big factor. Like the reason why AMD do NVIDIA minus 50 type pricing, or right now it's more like minus 150 pricing, is that actually, you are missing out on, DLSS 4.5 and NVIDIA Broadcast, and having better experience in Blender and video editing and things like that, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But basically, that is why AMD is cheaper. And also, obviously, AMD in general doesn't have 12-volt power connectors on their GPUs. I think 2 of the 9070 XT models do, the Nitro Plus and one of the ASRock cards. But in general, NVIDIA have gone full hog for 2 generations now with 12-volt power, even though it melts. And actually, it's 3 generations because NVIDIA, some of the RTX 30 series cards, the Founders Editions ones, I think had some form of 12-volt power, and then NVIDIA just didn't learn any lessons and actually made things worse and worse with the RTX 40 and 50 series, which is incredibly annoying. So it is nice not to have to worry about that with like an Intel or an AMD graphics card. But my next point is video editing and Blender and other professional workloads. In general, NVIDIA is way ahead here. Like when I first got into content creation, I had an RX 6700 XT, which was a fairly good mid-range graphics card, but often, video editing was jumpy and stuttery and everything else, even with a very good CPU and 64 gigs of RAM. Whereas when I switched over to an NVIDIA graphics card, suddenly everything was smoother. My GPU was being used more than my CPU, and the GPU was really doing some heavy lifting, and suddenly video editing was smooth. And I am aware that AMD have made some good jumps here with RDNA 4, and this is a really good video that I'll link to down in the description that shows off some of the benefits you get with RDNA RDNA 4 and the 9000 series. But unfortunately, it's not on the same level. Like Puget Systems or Puget Bench, they actually have lots of tests out there that show that, yeah, in general, NVIDIA graphics cards are way ahead for professional workloads compared to AMD. And especially with the RTX 50 series, which is called Blackwell, that introduced support for 10-bit 422 video, which is what I'm filming on right now. So basically, with my RTX 5070 Ti, I can scrub through this footage with no jumps or delays or anything else. And if I tried that with an AMD graphics card, it would not be as smooth. So really, that's a big benefit for me by actually having an NVIDIA GPU. And next I wanted to circle back to gaming, because when you look at like all the games that have been released in a particular year, what you tend to find is that NVIDIA tends to have more support and more exclusive titles than AMD does. And it is nice to see, you know, RDNA 4 and Redstone be supported in more and more launch games. That is a really good thing. But just in general, it is like easier to game with NVIDIA than it is with AMD, especially if you do like to play all the latest games. Like you often don't have to wonder, oh, will this new game support, you know, DLSS 4 or 4.5? Often it will if it's a well-known game, whereas with AMD, you just don't know that, or maybe it'll support some like Redstone features, but not all of them. So what would make me switch back from NVIDIA to AMD? Well, I think in general, when RDNA 4 came out, ideally that should have been ahead of DLSS 4, and then, you know, AMD could have followed up with Redstone and really pushed support and potentially beat out NVIDIA, who are more focused on AI. But obviously that didn't really happen. Like FSR 4 was a big step over, you know, FSR 3, but it was still behind DLSS 4, and now NVIDIA have brought out FSR 4.5 at a time where Redstone has been a little bit fumbled and not supported across the full suite of games. And sometimes it feels like NVIDIA aren't just a step ahead of AMD, they're kind of 2 steps ahead. You know, it does really feel like that. Like just the general gaming experience with NVIDIA GPUs is typically better than with AMD. The final thing that would make me switch is if AMD cards had better support in DaVinci Resolve, because that's what I use for video editing, and in general, as I mentioned earlier, NVIDIA are far ahead here, especially with 10-bit 422 video and things like that. So I think in general, you know, AMD certainly wins when it comes to value, but NVIDIA tends to win when it comes to consistency. And if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.